Scott Sigrist, down to our last lecture on Western ideologies. Um, we're going to move then next to Islamism. But the lesson here is on environmentalism. Uh, your book calls it ecologism. Um, we're more accustomed to the term environmentalism here in the U.S., but um, but let's look at that term ecologism for a moment. Um, it's a good word because it's more precise than environmentalism because it suggests more directly the concern with living organisms and their interrelatedness uh, with each other and with the larger natural world. Um, if you look at Merriam-Webster, ecologism is defined as a branch of science concerned with the interrelationship of organisms and their environment, or the totality or pattern of relations between organisms and their environment. Of course, we're talking about an ideology, not a branch of science. That is an important distinction. Um, but I mean, if you compare that idea concept of ecologism uh, with environmentalism, environmentalism indicates the natural environment, of course, but doesn't automatically connote natural, and it has a connotation of externality. I mean, it sounds like if you talk about the environment, it's like there's us human beings, and then out there, outside and around us, there is the environment, right? But in the ideological conception that's behind environmentalism, we human beings are considered as part of nature, right? Um, we're embedded within nature. We are one of many organisms embedded in nature, and that's important, uh, an important basis for our responsibility to this nature, right? Um, Let me make some distinctions. Hopefully, will be helpful in talking about environmentalists. I think you could kind of classify environmentalists in three groups. There's a kind of reform environmentalism that simply seeks practical measures to protect the environment, to reduce pollution, uh, recycling, that kind of thing, conservation, national parks, uh, all of that. And that's not necessarily ideological, right? And then there's lifestyle environmentalism, where a person makes uh, the concern for the environment central to managing their household, the way they live their lives. So, highly conscientious about recycling, buying organic foods, right? Just generally being environmentally conscious. But that also is not necessarily uh, ideological. I mean, a person who's living that way could be guided by an ideology, but not necessarily. The ideological versions, the third kind, um, involves a full-blown, ideological system and uh, political activism usually. So I'll give a sort of short general definition that applies to all these three groups, and then we'll dig in deeper to the ideological version. So, I mean, in general, I would say you could define environmentalism as an outlook concerned with fostering greater human sensitivity and responsibility to the natural world that we're part of. Right? Um, pretty basic. Um, but okay, so let's go deeper with the ideology. What is the ideological category that we should put environmentalism or ecologism in? I think it would be another case of what Michael Frieden called a micro ideology because it's focused on one particular dimension of human life, right? It's not offering a comprehensive political theory, not pretending to do that in most cases. Um, Although there is a tendency to interpret all the dimensions of life in in relation to this. It tends to be all encompassing. Uh, this environmentalism, ecologism, in this sense, um, uh, and I mean, similar to feminism, feminist the ideology of feminism sort of sees sex gender relations as affecting every area of human life, and you could say this about environmentalism too, but because it is a micro ideology um, in the sense of not having a fully worked out political theory, typically it attaches itself easily to other ideologies, just as feminism does, right? So you see it in your reading, for example, your readings attached to anarchism, attached to feminism, and maybe in ways that you wouldn't have expected uh, right off the bat. Um, but okay, so what about these relation to the other ideologies? I mean, environmentalism as an ideology, it's primarily a phenomenon on the left, right? It is and and is made common cause with neo-Marxism, feminism and identity politics, um, and uh, and anarchism is another one. The bête noire of uh, leftist environmentalism is capitalism, right? I mean, capitalism is seen as especially destructive of the environment, and it's a big part of the problem, and so that's part of the leftist outlook on it. And so in the examples in your readings, there's Vandana Shiva's uh, the selection from her Staying Alive, Women, Ecology, and Development, right? And it brings together a lot of these sort of these ideologies. But bottom line, I think uh, what's going on in the way she's presenting it is that capitalism, uh, she thinks, is essentially patriarchal. I mean, it's a it's a result of a patriarchal kind of approach. It's sort of aggressive male domination, whatever, and that connects to what Murray Bookchin's post-scarcity anarchism. That this uh, the devastation of the environment is a result of domination, right? Um, and of course, anarchy is opposed to domination of all kinds, and so that's the connection there. But there are conservative environmentalists, and some very notable cases. And usually, this is among traditionalists, as opposed to say uh, classical liberals, um, and so on. One very notable example is a guy named Wendell Berry, it's Berry, who writes novels and reflective pieces on um, how we can relate to nature, and uh, it kind of fits with this the traditional conservative sense of place. Um, you know where I'm from, my connection with a particular local community, and all of that. There's a strong sense of place, and that that comes along pretty naturally with the sense we want to preserve the beauty and uh, you know uh, the quality of the the land and the water and everything in that area, right? Um, and sort of closely associated with this perspective, there's a group that has gotten the name. I don't know if they named themselves this, but Crunchy Cons. I guess the vision of guy eating granola and his Birkenstocks and so forth. Sort of a back to nature conservative. And then there was a group in the in the first half of the 20th century mainly, called the Southern Agrarians, and they celebrated the agrarian life, traditional in the South, and all three of these traditionalist groups, unlike libertarians and Reaganites, I guess you could say, tended to be critical of capitalism. I mean, they had a lot of similar concerns about capitalism than as people on the left, for somewhat different reasons. I mean, in the case of the conservatives, it was, capitalism is a revolutionizing force, right? And it tends, communities have to change the way they do things, or they can't survive in the modern world, right? And so capitalism tends to undermine traditions and reshape communities, and it does tend to be, unchecked. It does tend to be destructive of the environment, and mining and digging for oil, whatever. So although they stress that they favor free markets, they they the capitalist version of free markets they're not huge fans of. They don't necessarily think we can get rid of capitalism or whatever, but they think we need to really guard against these revolutionary change that can come with capitalism. I should add as a caveat that these other conservatives, Reaganites, libertarians, aren't necessarily unconcerned with the environment, but they typically focus on technological solutions, rather than, sort of lifestyle um, kinds of issues, and they tend to think that capitalism, the sort of constant innovation in capitalism, will produce technologies that will enable us to protect the environment without having to, go back to family farming or something, the way Wendell Berry has. And you could note too that there's a logical connection between being conservative and conservation. I mean, conservative, somebody wants to conserve something. Conservation of traditional ways of life, conservation of land and natural beauty. It's at least logically it would go together. But going to the ideology, what are the concerns, aims, and key concepts? Well, the basic concern, I think, is human destruction of the environment, right, and the corresponding undermining of human life, quality of life, but also a concern with nature as an end in itself, something to be appreciated in and of itself, right? That we should have a kind of reverence for, um, and respect, right? And then the basic aims of environmentalism is preservation and nurture of the natural world through protection, conservation, and harmonious interaction with the environment, participating in nature as a harmoniously adapting organism, as opposed to conquering nature, which is it's a term often used by liberals. So using reason to conquer nature and to use it for our benefits, but that implied a certain perhaps lack of respect for nature. Um, and it lacked that kind of reverence that I just mentioned, and and it was consistent with that mentality was consistent with tearing up the earth for various modern projects, right? Key concepts. There's maybe a lot of things you could mention, but I'll mention four. First of all, the idea of an ecosystem, right? That all of life is interconnected and interdependent, um, and all of Earth's organisms, sort of are in an ecosystem like this, right? Secondly, related to that, is what is the nature of this independence? An important concept there, borrowed from biological sciences, right? Is symbiosis. The organisms need each other to survive and thrive, right? There's all kinds of food chains and materials for living that we depend on other organisms for, and right, and so so we need to realize that, embrace that, respect that. Um, Third concept, sustainability. Right, I mean, it's a buzzword, you hear it all the time these days, right? But living in a way, the idea is living in a way that will um, ensure the continuing availability of natural resources in the long run, right? The idea of being unsustainable is, right, you you waste the natural resources, you go through them too fast, and then they're not there available for you. So a simple example. So if you cut down forests, but don't plant trees to replace the trees that you've taken up, or if you use soil and to the point of erosion, then in the long run that those materials are not going to be available to you, right? Um, and then the fourth concept I would stress is this idea of simplicity, right? Um, you saw that in the Small is Beautiful article. Um, the idea of living a lifestyle that emphasizes necessities and functionality over luxuries, right? And it prizes serenity, right? A sort of serene harmony with nature. So think of Thoreau, Walden Pond, right? Um, the idea, you even have it in Rousseau, the idea that we need to reconnect with nature. We need to get away from all the noise and the stress of you know fast-paced modern life, and you know and establish this sort of inner peace that comes with reconnecting with nature, um, and then generally minimizing human impact on the natural world, right? Reducing our carbon footprint, as it's sometimes put, right? So the idea of small is beautiful. Instead of big, cement block buildings and so forth, massive, urban centers and so forth, that sort of small, small communities and buildings and so forth that sort of um, fit in to the natural landscape and the natural um, environment, right? Instead of uprooting it and destroying it, right? Um, you know, covering everything with parking lots and skyscrapers, right? Um, Small is beautiful, and then an idea that he didn't use this word, but um, frugal living. It's a word that the American founders like to use a lot. Frugality. In other words, not extravagant, not wasteful, um, not you know uh, living for creature comforts and luxury, but having a little more self-discipline, um, and, and being more satisfied with uh, you know things that are freely available through nature, rather than things that requires a kind of rat race to collect stuff, right? And along with this has come a a not uncommon interest among environmentalists in like Eastern religions, like Buddhism, saw that small, beautiful article talked about Buddhist economics, right? Um, Focusing on optimal usage as opposed to maximal consumption, right? Um, there's a one Eastern religion that took this kind of thing to an extreme, but it's an interesting uh, sort of parallel. It was a group. I think they're Buddhist, but it's a specific branch called Jainism, and the Jainists try part of their philosophy of life was that they should to the to, as much as absolutely possible they should not destroy any living thing, right? And so they would first of all they're vegetarians, uh, and they they hate as little as possible. Uh, for example, they careful not to step on uh, bugs, insects, right? All this kind of thing. I mean, they took it to what most people would consider an extreme. And one of the heroes among the Jainists was a guy who literally starved himself to death because he refused to kill any living thing. And that, of course, his life depended on uh, killing other living things to consume. So and but this is an extreme sort of parallel. But I mean, the the phenomenon today of vegetarians and vegans, right, which you do see more in the East than in the West, right? It kind of comes along with this personality. But it's worth I mean, um, in the case of a lot of these ideologies, even if you're not sort of an ideologue, which I think is good not to be an ideologue, but even if you're not fully on board with their outlook and their program, I mean, there are things like this simplicity of life is this is something that you can learn from and be valuable. I mentioned the American founders; they talked about frugality. It was living simple, maybe not Spartan, but simple lifestyles, because they saw that as more conducive to the Republican virtue of self-reliance, right? Um, and to the kind of personal discipline and sobriety that requires. So that's why John Adams, for example, in his essay "Thoughts on Government," ends with this paean to frugality and calling for that as part of his idea of a good society. And at first blush, if you didn't think about all this other stuff, you might think it's like a weird thing to bring up and to highlight. But that's the kind of thinking there. And Socrates, look at Socrates. I mean, Socrates thought that you know that eating big meals, for example, it caused your mind to be sluggish, and you couldn't reflect on the higher things, and so control of your body and discipline and living the simple life, he favored, right? So anyway, so what's the larger vision um, of environmentalism? Um, there's a lot of ways you could express it, I guess, but I thought the article we read from Donella Meadows from the book Beyond the Limits: Global Collapse or a Sustainable Future. I thought it was a nice sort of nutshell idea and revealing. So the vision for society, I quote her: a society that is materially sufficient, socially equitable, ecologically sustainable, and one that is more satisfying in human terms than the growth-obsessed society of today. So that's the kind of ideal society, uh, that environmentalists might have in mind. And then she mentions, a bunch of interconnected crusades, you might say, um, things that need to be done. And I'll quote her again: um, exploring energy efficiency and new materials, nonviolent conflict resolution, and grassroots community development, pollution prevention in factories and recycling in towns, ecological agriculture, and international protocols to protect the ozone layer, unquote. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, and some of it is maybe not uh, not intuitively what you would expect. I mean, nonviolent conflict, resolution. What does that have to do with the environment? But you see here, this happens a lot. You see, you have some overlapping ideologies going on, and sort of added to the grab bag mix of, and it's seen as compatible. I guess the idea there is, that war is really destructive, including destructive of the environment. But so with a description like this, you can sort of see a vision of society, even if there's not a full blown political theory attached to it. Um, you're already familiar with the mainstream practical program of environmentalism, but let me just kind of reel through the basics, to sort of bring it all together in your mind. You've got reducing pollution and the use of harmful chemicals harmful to human, animal, and plant life. Right. These were the original motives for the development of the ideology of environmentalism or ecologism, right? This was problem of pollution, the problem of harmful chemicals that were being used, like the insecticides that uh, uh, Rachel Rachel Carson talked about in Silent Spring, right? Um, so that was the initial motivation for the movement. Um, then you have preservation of natural resources, right? Natural materials for human use specifically is what we have in mind there, right? Through minimizing the use of presumably non-renewable sources like oil and coal. We're finding new pockets of oil, through fracking, right? Or at least we discovered shale that you could use this new technique to get oil and everything. And a lot of environmentalists have thought, well, that could have uh, you know unintended consequences of this new kind of drilling. But there's also the idea that, well, there's only so many pockets. Maybe I mean, it took millions of years for those deposits to be made. So you know, it's not going to replenish anytime soon if we use it all up, right? So minimizing use of non-renewable resources and increasing the use of renewable sources, sun, wind, water, that kind of thing, right? Um, and of course, this is kind of a holy grail of trying to find the technology that will finally make it, uh, efficient to use these kinds of, and maybe it's already enough for some hardcore environmentalists, but for most of the rest of the population, relying on these non-renewable resources, these renewable resources, uh, at this point, at our current level of technological, know-how, it's just not sufficient for living the kind of modern lives that we've come to expect, right? So so we'll see how that works out. Um, then you have a protection and conservation against destruction of nature. These are kind of overlap, right? But protecting against deforestation, soil erosion, water depletion, endangered animal species, uh, becoming extinct, natural beauty, destroying natural beauty, right? Um, Protection against all of those kinds of things, right? And then just promoting this harmonious living with nature, not only to help people see themselves as one organism among others in this interconnected web of life, but to act accordingly, not only through the above means, but in your own personal habits, right? Um, and then, so what are the means for achieving this stuff? Generally, we've got government regulation, right? Regulation of pollution, regulation of the use of waterways, you know, foresting guidelines, uh, lumber, you know, uh, the use of forest for lumber and so forth. Education is a big part of it, and part of this involves one of the things that um, is part of influences the public mind is statistical models, and of course this is useful, but it's also uh, you know, people have different models, and they're not always totally compatible. And there's some models that suggest things very bad, and some models that suggest things are not so bad. And you've seen a lot of this in the debates over global warming. Some people suggesting that the clock is ticking close to midnight, and the world is going to end in a relatively short period of time if we don't take drastic measures. And they base their claims on models that show a huge crisis. Other models don't show quite that, right? And among environmentalist scientists, you have a lot of disagreement about how great the crisis is. How much of it is caused by human activity, to what extent we can meaningfully do anything to change the course of it, and so on. To what degree is this kind of a natural cycle that the Earth goes through every so often? A lot of those debates are there, but certainly statistics is an important part of the educational process, and just doing what we're doing at the Citadel. I mean, we've got one of the strands in this new strand program is sustainability, right? So that's uh, it's it's uh, it's it's having an impact on college curricula and K through 12 curricula and so forth. Of course, you have um, simple things like recycling. Recycling studies do recycling, programs, family farming. You get more and more personal about the way you may do things. But all these are, sort of typical means to what is generally a mainstream practical program. Uh, it nowadays, for the kind of things that I just mentioned. What's controversial is not so much the goals here, but the means, and how much regulation is necessary, how much the economy will be affected by this. What really is the potential for renewable energy and so forth. And I'll end this basic sort of picture of what environmentalism looks like today with just kind of a notice of some of the radical action that's taken place on the radical wing of environmentalism. So, and I would put them in four categories: spectacular protests, doomsday warnings, uh, activist interventions, and eco-terrorism. So, example of spectacular protest. The most famous, the one that tends to get the news, most of the news is PETA. The PETA, the group. I'm not exactly sure what the acronym stands for, but it's this animal rights group that is opposed to killing animals. Protest things like factory farming. In fact, and mass production of chickens, whether they should be free ranging, whatever. But you've seen a lot of spectacular protests by PETA. Women stripping down and gets a lot of attention, and stuff like that, right? This is, this is not the moderate environmentalist. This is more on the radical side. The doomsday warnings. I mean, Al Gore, who was vice president under Bill Clinton, right after he lost to George W. Bush in the 2000 election, he kind of made environmentalism his mission and produced a film that was very influential. And he's sort of on a crusade, but he was one of the people, pointing to some of these statistical models and saying, it's our time is short. We have to really make some major changes, and so on. More recently, you've seen, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, talking about, she recently said something to the effect that we only have 12 years left, right? And it doesn't seem like many people believe that, and maybe she doesn't even. I mean, she doesn't act like she totally believes that, but in her behavior, I mean, people issuing dire warnings, and then there's this phenomenon of this teenage girl, Greta Thunberg, who I think they gave her a Peace Prize, a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm not sure, but she was just spotlighting the issue and trying to say, I think the famous line was, "How dare you?" People who just weren't getting serious enough for her taste about environmental issues. But it was all based on this kind of doomsday scenarios that we really, the Earth doesn't have long to go unless we make drastic changes and so forth. Then you have these activist interventions. The things I'm talking about are dramatic action that's been taken to shut down industrial activity or new housing development, so forth. One example of this, and this is sort of on the line between this intervention and eco-terrorism, but one thing I remember that they were doing, or some of these radical activists were doing to slow down deforestation, or big lumbering projects would put metal spikes in some of the trees so that if machinery or saw or whatever hit that, then it'd break the saw, or or the machine or something like that. This is getting close to ecoterrorism, because ecoterrorism is officially defined as destruction of property as well as killing. I'm not aware off the top of my head people who have been killed by eco-terrorists, but there's been a lot of destruction of property that that also obviously could be dangerous, explosions and so forth. Again, eco-terrorism is on the FBI. There's a couple of groups on the FBI watch list as for association with terrorism in this form. So that's my overview. Let's evaluate a little bit philosophically by looking at specifically this this argument put forth by I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correct, but Henri Naess, Naess, from his book Ecology, Community, and Lifestyle: An Outline of an Ecosophy. What he means is a philosophy of ecology, or ecosophy. And he's noticing that this sort of a void to be filled. There's not like feminism and other micro ideologies. There is often not been, the focus has often been more on activism, right, and sort of making small scale arguments as opposed to presenting a more comprehensive philosophical perspective. And he tries to do this here, right? Um, so let me briefly review what he said, and then offer some perspective. So first of all, his key premises are the interconnectedness of everything. That's where he is, of everything. And I think he means um, inanimate as well as animate. Non-organic as well as organic. He's focused more on the organic, but that everything is interconnected, and that in human terms, most importantly, our identities as individuals is developed through interaction with, quoting him, interaction with a broad, manifold, organic and inorganic environment. Right. So, um, so and so he says, we are part of the ecosphere. We are um, constituted by it in some ways. I mean, we we take our identity from it. Whether I think you mean whether it's talking about the place where you came from, or the attitudes you developed in relation to uh, contact with nature. This partially defines who we are, and we're maybe not as conscious of that as we could be, but he thinks this is the case. So that's a fundamental premise: the interconnectedness of everything and our embeddedness uh, in that web of life and uh, non-organic uh, world as well. Um, and then he tries to map out a kind of basics of a theory of justice, right? So first of all, there's a definition of rights, and he defines a right as the unfolding of potentialities, and what he means is natural potentialities, right? Um, so I mean, so you have here you have liberal language here, right? The liberal terminology of rights, but you also have an Aristotelian conception of nature, right? Aristotle's idea of nature was the nature of a thing is its potential, what it could develop into, what it could be at its most mature development. That was the nature of a thing, right? And Ness is saying um, that's the basis of right, the the, the, um, the unfolding of potentialities. And so, and Aristotle said something similar about right, um, that what's good for human beings is reaching their potential. Their, that what's good for human beings was defined in terms of reaching your potential, and so that all your natural capacities get fully developed and fully activated and so forth. And that's the ideal, right? So he's somewhat in line with Aristotle there, but Ness wants to extend the rights, uh, you know, much more broadly, right? The rights of nature, natural rights. He wants to extend to plant and animal life, right? Encompasses the rights of plants and animals. So quoting from him, one exercises justice or injustice to plants and animals as well as to human beings. So, this is certainly a different way of thinking about it than most people have and have had. But he wants to include them, encompass non-human life within the scheme of rights, right? And the foundational right is the right to live. Um, Specifies that this is not an unlimited right, uh, but that there is such a right requires limiting norms for conduct, right? Now, I'll flesh that out more in a second. In terms of the human relation to nature, um, Ness says, quoting, "We are part of the ecosphere." Um, Actually, that's the end of that quote. But we have a partially independent existence from it in the sense of retaining a genuine individuality, right? So Ness wants to steer a sort of middle path between a kind of pantheism in which individually is lost in the stream of, of existence on one side, and on the other side, an atomic individualism, right? Where atomic individualism has the idea of, you know, so the original idea of atoms is they're sort of these solid balls, and they're, you know, they're isolated, they're separate, they can't fuse or whatever, and so atomic individualism is that, you know, we sort of go our own ways, we're self-enclosed individuals, and he thinks that's off too. So he wants to retain a sense of human individuality, but also at the same time see human beings as sort of embedded in this web of life, right? Um, his conception of history, he says that the historical process, the term he uses, includes geological history. And this is the wider history, but within that, what he calls an integrated unfolding of life. That's the historical process. This process of geological evolution um, and evolution of life, um, that is integrated and is a kind of unfolding of those potentialities we were talking about, right? In this respect, he's kind of on the same page as Hegel. Hegel used a kind of Aristotelian category of unfolding of potential um, uh, across history, right? So there's an idea of you as an individual, and this is the way Aristotle used it. You as an individual, or as a society, you had certain potentialities, and you could develop those. And this idea of Hegelian types, you know, their vision of history was that those capacities could unfold beyond the level of the individual and even the community over the whole course of history, so that there was a continuing progress in that sense, right? And so you know, there seems to be an element of that here with Ness. And then man's place within this process is one of participation. He uses the term participation. Quote, human beings who wish to attain a maximum perspective in a comprehension of their cosmic condition can scarcely refrain from a proud feeling of genuine participation in something immensely greater than their individual and social career, right? So that's the conception of history. Then he raises the question, what are the common principles of life? Are there certain fundamental principles that is sort of behind everything? And his answer is sort of the liberal answer plus. So the basic liberal answer that you saw with Hobbes and Locke, for example, was the drive for self-preservation, right? This is driving us. So Aquinas mentioned this as one of the human drives, the lowest, but there are others. Hobbes reduced everything to that one drive, really, fundamentally. So it's kind of along the lines of what Nietzsche said in a more sophisticated way about the will to power, which is the will to life, really. Locke built upon that a little bit, saying that that there's a kind of drive to preserve the species, although he seems to kind of fold that into a desire for self-preservation. And then there's, of course, Darwin, the adaptation and the development, the evolution of things, in the struggle for life. And Ness accepts that that's one of the common principles that underlies the historical process. But there's another one. He thinks it's critical that this be added on. He calls it self-realization or self-unfolding. So this is that unfolding of potentiality thing we were talking about. But it's interesting here, and it's telling, and I'll talk more about it later. But in this expression, self-realization or self-unfolding, the S is capitalized. self with a capital S, and he does not mean individual self, or at least not solely that. So we'll come back to that. Um, Ness, the political theorist that Ness specifically mentions, or philosophers more generally, is Spinoza, who is another kind of liberal thinker, um, I think writing in the 1600s, who developed his own sort of theory about nature, and it was essentially pantheistic, you could say. Um, the world, the whole world was kind of an organism, and we were each sort of parts of that, if you will. I'm not doing justice to it, but he appeals to Spinoza, and you do see a hint of kind of a pantheistic outlook. It's not a pantheism that negates the individuality of specific things, but it is kind of this ecosphere has a whiff of this, right? And he also mentions Henri Bergson, who was an important 20th century thinker, presented the theory of creative evolution. So a philosophical development beyond Darwin, where he talked about sort of everything being in movement, including consciousness, and consciousness is involving just as the physical body evolves, and so on. So he's influenced by a number of philosophical trends. Ness is. But then, at this point, after he's gone this far, he reformulates that foundational right a little, refines it a little bit. So he had said, the foundational right is the right to live. Now he says the foundational right is the universal right to live and blossom. Right. So it's universal, first of all, applies to all living things, right? But it's not just to stay alive, but it's to reach your potential, blossom, flourish, right? And that again fits with Aristotle's basic idea, right? I mean, for Aristotle, happiness, the definition of happiness in the full, rich sense was living up to your potentiality. When you live up to your potentiality, and every part of you is activated to the full, that's what Aristotle calls happiness. And Ness is on the same wavelength. Then he talks about equal rights, and says that all living things have an equal right to this, to live and blossom, right? And this is where he would lose a lot of people in the modern as well as ancient thought, right? The idea it was always assumed that human beings had a special place above and beyond other plant and animal life, that rights applied specifically to human beings, and wouldn't have made sense to them to think about animals and plants having rights. But let's flesh this out a little further. So Ness clarifies he does not mean that other life forms cannot be killed or used, like the Janist, right? He's not going that far. So again, this right to live, even to live, much less to blossom, is not unlimited. What he means rather is that these must be limited, killing, using other things in the world must be limited as much as reasonably possible, right? So here's his quote. An equal right to unfold potentials as a principle is not a practical norm about equal conduct towards all life forms. It suggests a guideline limiting killing and more generally limiting obstruction to the unfolding of potentialities in others, meaning other life forms, right? And so this kind of all brings us to what you could say is his conception of the best way of life. the best way of life, negatively, you would say, is living according to that guideline, that that norm of conduct to limit killing and limit obstruction of the development of of, of other life forms, right? Not only other human beings, but all life forms, right? It's a negative expression of it, what you're not supposed to do. Positively, it's living in harmony with the ecosphere, and specifically developing, the way he puts it, Ness puts it, a more expansive perspective on the life of ecospheric belonging, a sense of belonging to the ecosphere, in accordance with the principle of symbiosis, and living in, quote, in service of the great self, unquote. Again, self capitalized. And the great self seems to be the ecosphere. Right? So religious overtones here, right? So that's a very interesting philosophical working out of the ideas here involved. We the video is already getting long, so I'm going to move to a second video for my own analysis of what Ness said and of environmentalism more broadly. So I'll see you then.